Well, this week, our castaway is the concert pianist, Sir Clifford Curzon. Sir Clifford, what's been the guiding principle in choosing your 8 records? Nostalgia, great music?
Well,
great
first of all,
performances?
I've tried to imagine myself on this island. People tell me I've taken it much too seriously. But, of course, the island has never been described, has it? I've listened to a number of these programs, and I've thought about the island. I've even discussed it with my doctor, but then I discuss everything more or less with him, more or less. And he said, well, I think the trouble is you think of this island as a cartoon island, and I thought it was a wonderful description. It's exactly what I do. I think of it, if I think of it at all, as a very small patch of sand with probably a single palm tree and a skull or something, or a discarded bikini, and surrounded by an endless tropical ocean. Yes. And I don't expect to be rescued from it.
It's got more than one palm tree.
I shall be planning my escape, but we'll deal with that at the end. And so I try to imagine how it would be. I would certainly be, I think, half unconscious, really, after a few hours. And so I've tried to choose the records that I would rather like to hear towards the end of my life. Mm-hmm. And therefore I should be in this semi-comatose state, and as when I fall asleep at night, my mind often goes back to my childhood. It probably will go back to my childhood, and I think I would like to be reminded. It's something to do with a sort of adding a coda to something. It would be complete, I think, if I was taken back to the very first music that awakened my own musical responses. Yes, and that was as a child in my father's house. My uncle was Albert W. Kettelby, a very famous composer of the time.
Now?
Yes. And, of course, I was supposed to be in bed. Little Clifford was supposed to be in bed, but he never was. He was out sitting on the landing, listening to my uncle playing through the well of the stairway of my father's old house. And so the first music I really heard were these immortal melodies of Kettelby, and I think it would be very nice to, perhaps to have in a monastery garden, let's say. I think that was his most famous piece, as part of my group.
Albert W. Kettelby himself conducting his own concert orchestra in a monastery garden.
Even the cover of that music I remember very well, and I think it awakened other later loves of mine, painting and gardening. I remember the cover with very herbaceous cloister garden with monks wandering around chanting and so on, and that was a very important thing for me too.
Yes, painting has been a great interest.
Yes, I've collected paintings all my life. Mm-hmm. And I'm an ardent gardener. My gardener might think otherwise. I'm very, very good at telling other people how gardening should be done. That is, after all, a form of gardening, but because I have to take care of my hands.
Now, your next record.
For number 2, I think I should like to go all the way from Kettelby to what I consider to be one of the most perfect works of art, the Mozart Piano Concerto. That would remind me of wonderful times playing with great orchestras. And I would, in thinking of Mozart's life, it would also remind me of how little power suffering had over the greatest geniuses. And so my own suffering would seem less great. For instance, I remember Benjamin Britten saying to me, it must have been during the war, after he'd come back from America, that he had only to think of Mozart in order to be happy in any circumstances. And this remark of his has always remained with me. I thought it was a rather remarkable thing to have said.
Indeed.
And so I'm sure I would want Mozart, and I would... I think the Concerto in C, K467, is one of the most perfect works of art. One of the most beautiful pieces ever written. And so I think I would like that. And I would especially like the slow movement, which is one of the most enchanting, I mean, I use that word deliberately, one of the most enchanting pieces of music ever written, I think.
Arthur Schnabel in the Mozart Piano Concerto No. 21, K467, the slow movement. You're a Londoner, aren't you, Sir Clifford?
Yes, I was born in London.
At what age did you take to the piano, and was it your idea, or were you put to it?
Well, I think I was put to it. My father was a businessman, and so I was put to it because my uncle had made so much money. And he thought, I think, that little Clifford would also make a lot of money. Well, it took a bit longer for me to make a lot of money.
Now, as a child, you had all these hours of practice. How did you feel about that when the other boys were out playing?
Well, I resented it, I think. Yes, I remember sort of my brother and sister being on holiday at Brighton, and I was at the back of the barber shop where there was a piano doing my practice. And that didn't appeal to me at all.
When did it really
But I don't think I was intended to be a long-haired musician. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence to the contrary now, isn't there, really? But I think my father thought I would write some more monastery gardens, and I didn't. I think just to annoy him. He did send me to the Royal Academy of Music at a very early age, and I think to annoy him, I just went long hair, that's all.
You were the youngest pupil that ever accepted it.
I believe so, in the senior school, yes.
You began to mop up every prize and award there was in sight.
Well, I wasn't the supreme opera, but I got them all eventually.
What was your second subject?
My second subject, well, I started to play the violin at school. So the violin was my first subject, really, and I switched, but I made the most excruciating noises on that instrument and could hardly even tune it, and so I moved over to the piano.
Do you remember your first professional appearance?
My mother used to talk about it because she said I played the violin, and then I came on and played the piano, and then I came on and recited something. And that was quite a lot for a small child. And I remember, and I always, when I read about Charlie Chaplin, I always remember, I know he was born in Kennington, and I remember that my first appearance for £1 was in a very, very cold church in Kennington.
Yes. And you did all those three things?
And I did all three things, yes.
6 and 8 pence each.
Well, yes, that sounds like a solicitor's fee, doesn't it?
Well, now we've got your third record. What's that to be?
Well, I'd no intention of using this program, of course, as a platform for my own recordings, no matter how artfully I might have been able to introduce them. But I think I would like one, an extremely short one, I hope, of my own, because it would remind me, in those terrible circumstances of being on this little bit of sand out there, it would have reminded me that I had, in my lifetime, reached a stage where I had been able to twiddle my fingers pretty brightly. So I think perhaps to put on a recording of something that wouldn't perhaps be so associated with my name in my later years, my later repertoire, let's put it that way, and I think perhaps the Dance of the Gnomes or Gnomenreigen of Liszt would rather well represent the middle of my career.
Liszt's Norman Reigen, your own recording. You were only 16, I believe, when you made your first appearance at a prom. Was that a big milestone for you?
Oh, yes, of course. I was one of the three pianos in a three-piano concerto by Bach. Yes. Well, it was a milestone because I met Sir Henry Wood through this engagement, and because I was a student at the Academy, and we were chosen to play this, and after all, I owe everything to Sir Henry Wood.
He was a great figure.
He took me around with him, and he was so helpful, and he gave me engagements whenever he could, and he told me about the great pianists of the past. And he was so kind, take an insignificant little student. If we had a concert in Wales or somewhere, he would always take me out to supper afterwards and introduce me to Rhine wine, which he liked very much. No, my debt to him is simply not to be calculated at all.
You went on for 2 or 3 years giving concerts of some distinction. Then you decided in your own mind that you still didn't feel ready.
Well, I doubt whether I ever felt I was ready, certainly. We have a very funny sort of artist who thinks he's ready, but I know what you mean. But I just happened, suddenly, I don't know what took me to the hall, because I hadn't really heard of him before. I suddenly heard Schnabel in a small hall, the Grotra in Steinweg. It was half empty. And I thought I'd never heard anything so marvellous, and there was only one thing to do. The only thing to do was to start life again in Berlin. So I gave up everything. I was already a sub-professor, I think, at the Royal Academy. And gave up everything and went and lived in Berlin for 2 years. Studied with him. So in that way, I started life again.
Well, it would seem to have been a wise decision, because there has been, since then, 50 years of great success and achievement.
There have been lots of new beginnings. I think that's what the artist's life is about, But that was the most important new beginning of my life, certainly.
Let's have another record. What shall we have now? Number 4 we've got to.
Well, now let me see. Number 4. Well, I certainly, I'm quite ready. Indeed, I shall by then be longing for that most beautiful of sounds, the human voice. And if a beautiful human voice could be combined with some music that evokes a beautiful landscape, I've had quite enough of the sea by now, that would be lovely. And I think the two are combined in a song by Brahms. I must have Brahms anyway. A song by Brahms, Feld Einsamkeit, Loneliness in the Fields, or however one would translate it, sung by Helene Gerhardt, whose voice is always in my mind as one of those special interior models that one has for sound. If one is a pianist, you've got to obviously have the thought of some other kind of musical sound in your mind other than the piano. So I would choose Feld Einsamkeit, sung by Helene Gerhardt.
Helene Gerhardt singing Feld Einsamkeit by Brahms. Do you still practice every day?
Yes, I still put my hands on the piano every day, I think, unless I'm in a train or something. I've always had at the back of my mind something that Leschetizky said, the great piano teacher of the turn of the century. He said, if you haven't been able to practice, you should go to the piano at night and put your hands on the keyboard and say good night to it. So sometimes I just say good night to my piano, yes. But in general, I'm a pretty hearty practicer, yes.
Apart from the repertoire of Beethoven and Brahms and César Franck and Schumann and Tchaikovsky, you've always taken a great interest in contemporary music.
Yes, earlier on I played a great deal. A fair amount of it is dedicated to me and so on. And
who in particular has composed for you?
Well, the second Rawsthorn concerto was really written for me. It's not actually dedicated on the copy, but because it was for the, not the Battle of Britain, what was it? The
Festival
of Britain. Same thing, yeah.
Almost as noisy.
Almost as noisy, yes. And Lennox Berkeley's lovely piano sonata was written for me, and some of William Alwyn's earlier piano music was written for me, and so on.
Do you ever have problems? This is something that always occurred to me in the concert hall. Do you always have absolute rapport with the conductor when you are doing concerto works?
No, not necessarily. It's wonderful when you do have. On the other hand, it's sometimes rather stimulating.
To have a little scrap.
when there's quite a bit of scrapping going on in the back. And I think you must believe that you're both ultimately going to behave like gentlemen. Yes, you're not going to throw the score at one another on the platform or anything like that. But sometimes it's quite stimulating, and I've yet to play with any conductor from whom I didn't learn something.
Yes. Sure.
However young or in his dotage or whatever, there's always something.
Yes,
That's why I've never heard a piano recital from which I didn't learn. From the veriest beginner, I can learn something.
Record number 5. What have we got now?
Well, you know, playing the Gerhardt record brought to mind the sound of the pianist who, I think, has reproduced most successfully that kind of wonderful sound, and that was Paderewski. And he was a wonderful player of Schumann. I can still remember how he played certain phrases. 50 years later, I can remember that. And as I must have Schumann, after all, he was the most, how can one describe him, the most comforting and consoling of composers, I would like to have a recording of Paderewski playing Schumann. There's Abends of Schumann. I'm sure it's a very old recording and so on, but I think if you listen carefully, you can still hear that this was a quite exceptional sound.
Paderewski playing one of the Schumann Fantasiestücke des Abends. And it was recorded, I see, on the label in London in June 1912.
Yes, it's really a voice from the past, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yes.
You love playing chamber music, don't you? You guest very frequently with the Amadeus Quartet.
Yes.
And you formed your own piano quartet for a while.
Well, I didn't form it. It was in the sad period when Schnabel died. And he had been part of a very distinguished quartet with Szigeti, the violinist, Primrose, the viola, and Fournier, the cellist. And they were giving a whole series of recitals. And so I took over from my great and revered teacher. It was, I think, one of the greatest honours I've ever received. And then we did play a lot of chamber music at the Edinburgh Festival. And in London, I remember we played for some charity. I think part of Devon was badly flooded. And we gave a concert in the festival hall, and we played all 3 Brahms piano quartets in one evening. I think it went on till midnight.
And enjoyed yourself hugely.
Enjoyed ourselves. Yes, I of course love to play chamber music. I mean, I don't feel there's any difference between playing chamber music and any other kind of music. And it was Schnabel who pointed out, with the usual sort of paradox that he loved, he said, when you play solo, you should play more chamber music, which he meant you should pay more attention to inner voices and basses and play with... Well, play it like chamber music.
Just a splendid way of putting it.
Yes, and I think you can hear it in his playing all the time.
Number 6. What's that?
Well, for the next 2 recordings, I should like to have reminders of my 2 greatest teachers, the 2 greatest artists among my teachers, and they were both great pioneer spirits. So for number 6, I would take Wanda Landowska, who, after all... at that time, the harpsichord was a very much neglected instrument, and her magisterial playing of it certainly brought it to the forefront of all our musical lives again. And I don't think I know anything more stirring than her performance of the great Passacaglia of Couperin, and I think I would like to have that. It would also remind me of the long, long hours of laborious but absolutely invaluable study that I had with her in her house on the outskirts of Paris. I think I dropped out of the musical world also for a period to study with her for about a year, 6 months or a year. And she really taught me how to work. And those are the people to whom one owes most, I think, because knowing how to work brings you freedom.
Van der Landowska playing the Couperin Passacaglia. Now, you've talked about your gardening, Sir Clifford. I see that you list swimming as another of your favourite occupations. Both these skills would be very useful on your desert island.
Well, my swimming wouldn't help me at all, because it's just a gentle breaststroke.
Well, you could cultivate at any rate. Have you ever done any fishing?
No, I can't follow fishing through to its end, you see. It's all very lovely to throw out a line and tickle along like that. But then when you've got to deal with the dirty work at the end...
It gets a bit sordid.
I can't... that's not my way.
Would you try to escape?
Yes, but not in the way you... not in the way you think I would.
I see.
And I'm afraid that does bring me to one of your later questions, my way of escape. Do you mind if I answer that a little later in the programme? What I'd like to do is get rid of my records, first of all.
All right. What's your next one?
Well, the other great teacher, of course, was Schnabel. Of the two, I said, who were great pioneer spirits. And, of course, in Schnabel's case, he was a pioneer in the performing of all the works of Schubert. I think he introduced them even to the great Leschetizky. I think Leschetizky was quite surprised at some of the things the boy... He was only a young boy. He was with Leschetizky from the age of 9 till 15, and I've got, somewhere in my archives, I've got a program of Schnabel's first appearance in Vienna. He was 15, and on it you will find the posthumous A major sonata of Schubert. Mm-hmm. And it's rather touching, in a way, to think of this boy understanding already at that age the unbelievable beauties of these late Schubert works, and at the same time still playing rough. True. So I would certainly take the A major sonata with me, because it was that sonata, you may remember, which I heard in the Grotrian Steinweg Hall, which sent me to Berlin for 2 years.
Schnabel playing the scherzo from Schubert's posthumous A major sonata. And that brings you to your last record.
Well, I can't think of number 8 without thinking of it as my last record. That's the one I'm going to put on last. And I suppose, it'll sound terribly sentimental, but it's something that I would like to be reminded of right with the last breath to the very end, and that is of all-conquering love, love stronger than death, as I think Wagner understood it. And so I for my last record, I would like the Liebestod of Wagner.
Kirsten Flagstad singing the Liebestod from Tristan and Isolde with Wilhelm Furtwängler conducting. If you could take just one disc instead of the 8.
Well, it would be awfully difficult to choose, but I think I would have to go back to Mozart.
K467.
Yes.
And one luxury to have with you. Anything you like that's of no practical use.
Well, I can think of the one thing that I would want to take with me, and I don't know that I would describe it as a luxury. Well, I would want a pill to put me firmly to sleep forever when I'd had enough. And that I would, with this pill, be absolutely certain of not waking. And I probably would put the Liebestod on the gramophone and take the pill. And that's the end of my desert island.
Now, before that unhappy event, you would have one book to read.
I think I would probably choose a good Victorian novel. The kind that one can read over and over again. I think, perhaps choose something like George Eliot's Middlemarch.
Yes.
I happen to admire her very greatly. It's full of wisdom on human affairs, full of understanding of human frailty. Yes, I think it's a very comprehensive affair, a novel of that quality. In fact, there isn't any other novel quite like that. I think I probably would choose George Eliot.
George Eliot's Middlemarch.
Yes.
And thank you, Sir Clifford Curzon, for letting us hear your Desert Island Disc.
Thank you very much, Mr. Plomley.
Goodbye, everyone.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Desert Island Discs archive. For more podcasts, please visit bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.